Hello, I'd like to talk today about choosing the most appropriate methods of data collection. And the presentation will outline a range of methods which can be used to collect qualitative data. And by qualitative data, I mean the data that you need to interpret rather than quantitative data which you need to analyse statistically. The ideas that I'm going to suggest are more fully discussed in a book that I wrote with Anne Burns called Researching Language Teacher Cognition and Practice, which was published in 2012. As I'm sure you know, there are many ways of collecting qualitative data. And by qualitative, I mean the sort of data that you need to interpret and evaluate subjectively, as opposed to data, quantitative data, that can be counted and analysed statistically. So I think there are a number of ways that you can choose, and I put them into three headings: elicitation, observation, and reflection. Eliciting means asking people what they do, what they know, what they believe. And this can be done through questionnaires, through interviews, and perhaps by narrative frames. Observation can include listening as well as observing, or listening instead of observing. And you can do this with quasi-experiments, with recorded decision-making sessions, like classroom observation, live or recorded, and observed decision-making, which I will call think aloud. And as for reflection, we're asking people what they did or what they thought they did and why they did it. We can have stimulated recall, focus group, or reflective journals. Now I'm going to explain each of these in more detail, but of course I am far from suggesting that you should try them all. But I think two or three make a good combination. It's for you to decide what is the best combination according to your research question. Okay, so in each case I'll outline the purpose of the instrument or tool or procedure, and then raise some questions which you may like to discuss afterwards. So firstly, a questionnaire. What purposes does a questionnaire serve? Well, it can elicit participants' attitudes. Now, I make a distinction between attitudes and beliefs. If you ask people to fill in a questionnaire, normally you would expect them to do this in 15-20 minutes. And if you have a number of items, you're not going to get very deeply held beliefs, because people can't spend a lot of time answering questionnaires. So you can just get the surface, the attitudes, and you can't really probe beliefs in a questionnaire. You can obtain background biodata. You can find out information about how long they've been teaching, what qualifications they have, perhaps their age, their gender, that might be important. And another useful thing that can be done with questionnaires is to recruit participants for further study, for further stages of your study. For example, if you plan to have some interviews and some observations, the questionnaire can be framed so that the last question is something like, if you would like to talk more about this, or if you would be willing to be interviewed about this, please put your email below, or perhaps please email me at. So there are a number of purposes that can be served. I don't think that they are particularly reliable. I'm not sure why people should tell you the truth when they're answering questionnaires. Think about questionnaires that you've answered. Have you always thought deeply and answered the questions truthfully, or have you tried to slide over them? Then, of course, the question arises as to how to issue a questionnaire. In the old days, we used to post them by mail with stamps on. But nowadays you can put them on a website like SurveyMonkey. You could ask people to do a questionnaire by attaching a questionnaire to an email. Or perhaps, and this is often the best way to do it, is to give it to them by hand and to explain to each individual why you're doing the project. Of course, that takes time. It can also be useful to do a questionnaire with everybody in the same room. Then a questionnaire may consist of a number of items, not always questions, they can be statements with which people will agree or disagree, so they can be questions or statements, but how many would you have? And will they be all open-ended questions which people have to write answers to, or are they all tick boxes? Now you do need to pilot the questionnaire. It's most important because once the questionnaire is sent, you can't change it. So it's very important to pilot the questionnaire. The question is, with whom do you do this? You can't pilot a questionnaire with the very people you're going to use as participants in your study. So a number of questions to think about. Above all, how reliable is the data that you're going to collect from a questionnaire? Another means of eliciting people's attitudes and what they believe is through an interview. So you can probe attitudes in more depth than is possible in a questionnaire. Because if the participant or the interviewee answers a question, you can ask a second or third question. And in that way you can go beyond the surface of their attitudes and opinions, perhaps to deeper beliefs. Interviews are always useful to uncover new issues. It's surprising when I interview people, I have my own agenda, but often they come up with very interesting ideas that I want to explore with other interviewees. And it should help you to establish rapport, a good relationship with your interviewee. Again, particularly if you want to use that interviewee in another part of your research. For example, you may want to observe them teaching, or you may want to listen into a lesson planning session, something like that. So it's a good way to build a good relationship with your participants. A number of questions arise in interviews. First of all, it's how structured it should be. A lot of interviews are simply like questionnaires, but spoken. Those we call tightly structured, fully structured interviews. At the other end, they can be very loose and just let the participants say what they want to say. Probably the best course is to have what we call a semi-structured interview, where you have a number of focus points, not necessarily questions, but focus points that you want to discuss with your participants, and then go into more depth and as the responses come. An important question, it also applies throughout research, is what language should you use? If, for example, you are interviewing people who speak the same language as you, it seems probably more sensible to interview them in that language than English. After all, it's very difficult to think deeply in a second language, even if we are teachers of that language. Our better thinking comes in our first language. You need to think too, of course, as to how long an interview should last. I would recommend 30 to 40 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes. And if you're lucky, it may last longer because the participant is interested in talking to you. That's always a good sign of whether you've established a good rapport, if the interviewee is prepared to talk longer than you expect them to. You need to think too about how many interviews you need to do with the same person or with different people, and when these are going to be, and where. They should be at a time and place convenient to the participant, which may be inconvenient to you. And as I've pointed out, it's very important to think about the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer. If, for example, you are interviewing your students, they know that you're their teacher and you know they're your students, and that may interfere with the validity of what they tell you. So a number of things to think about. An interesting idea which has arisen from Gary Barkhausen is the idea of a narrative frame. Narrative frame is a sort of guided composition, where we ask people, teachers, students, colleagues, to write stories based on their experiences in the form of a guided composition. There's a simplified version just here, and you can see that it's a series of question starters and linkers. A successful lesson I recently taught was ... It was successful because I ... And the students, one problem that arose was, and I dealt with it by... On reflection, I think that, and the next time I teach this sort of lesson, I'll... So you get the idea, it's a sort of guided composition. And what's interesting about this is that when people tell stories about themselves, they implicitly reveal their beliefs and values. And participants are free to choose, more free than in an interview, what they want to talk about, which events to relate. And an important advantage of the narrative frame is by asking your participants to write it, you don't have to transcribe the data, which you have to do with an interview. So a number of questions arise. How much structure to put into the frame? Do you need to give a lot or little? And there is a point here about whether you ask them to complete a narrative frame on a piece of paper or whether you ask them to complete a frame as an email attachment of a Word doc. Because if they are using a word processing tool, they can write as little or as much as they want, whereas if you've given it to them on paper, they are constrained by the amount of space that you've allowed them. As with interviews, the issue arises as to which language, and once again I would suggest that the best way to do this is to ask them to write in their own language, their first language, or their preferred language. If it happens to be a language that you do not speak, it's not difficult to find somebody who will assist you to translate what they say. May cost a bit of money, but I think it's better that the participants feel free to use whichever language they want to tell their stories. The issue arises, again with interviews, as to the truth and honesty of what they tell you. Now, in my opinion, what they tell you doesn't have to be factually true. A successful lesson I recently taught, well, it can be kind of hypothetical or imaginary. But the point is that even if it's an imaginary or hypothetical story, their beliefs and values are still there, whether it's true or not. Think about that. So questionnaires, interviews and narrative frames are three different ways of eliciting data from research participants. We come on now to observation. And one of the ways that people want to observe what people do is by an experiment. A true experiment is virtually impossible to do by teachers in their classrooms. A true experiment needs at least the following features. A true experiment. The hypothesis is needed to disconfirm a statement. So you have to formulate one or more statement which you seek to find confirm or preferably disconfirm. You need to have a randomized sample of a total population. In other words, if you're going to do an experiment in your school, you should, in order to do a true experiment, have a randomized sample of all the school students. For example, by looking at the school register and taking every third name or every fifth name at random. But most of us would do research in our own classrooms, and that would not be a true sample of a whole school. We will call that a convenience sample. When you've got your group of students, if we are talking about students, to experiment upon, we need to give them a pre-test to find out their established level of learning. And when they've done the pre-test, we need to put them into matched pairs. We need to find the two best, and put them each in one group, and the next best, put them in one group, another group. So you need to have two groups of equal ability according to the test. Then you need to put the two groups, one into a control group and one into an experimental group. The experimental group receives the treatment, the teaching that you're going to give, and the control group doesn't. When you've finished this treatment, which may be 3-4 weeks, no more, you need to give a post-test and find out whether there is any significant difference between the experimental group, which tried the treatment, and the control group, which didn't. And you should, maybe 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, have a delayed post-test to see whether those results can be confirmed. And then you need to analyse the data using an appropriate statistical test. Now, frankly, you can't do all of that in a classroom, in your own classroom. And therefore, you need to do a quasi-experiment. Quasi is a Latin word meaning almost. And what you have to do is to control as many variables as you can, and then account for the differences with interpreting the statistical data more carefully. So, really, if you want to carry out experimental studies, you've got to do a quasi-experiment. But frankly, I don't advise it. A very different approach to observing what people do, very different from an experiment, is to do think aloud sessions. Now, the purpose of a think aloud session is to overhear and perhaps observe people's decision making. For example, if you think about teaching, you could think about how teachers make decisions when they're planning a lesson, or maybe when they're selecting or evaluating a textbook, course book. Some people have asked people to think aloud while they're giving feedback on students' written work, or maybe when they're preparing tests, or maybe when they're thinking about group work. And this can be done either by asking individuals to think aloud, or by asking 2 or more participants to discuss these together. Now, in this way, you can capture what they're thinking by what they're saying, either to themselves or to each other. Vygotsky called this capturing thinking processes as they occur cognition in flight. You actually capture what people are doing by what they are saying. And then if you're using this as a way of collecting data, you might want to compare this with what they say in an interview or what they do in a classroom to identify their beliefs and their practices. Now, there are a number of issues about thinking aloud, particularly when it comes to asking an individual to think aloud. And a good example of this is asking somebody to think aloud as they are giving feedback on students' assignments. So you can hear them thinking, oh, that's a good assignment, that's a very good point. Oh dear, what a terrible mistake. And you can hear them saying that. But how natural is it to think aloud? Some people find it easy, inevitable to think aloud. Others people find it very difficult. One issue is how closely does thinking aloud actually reflect the thinking? By simply putting your thoughts into words, there's a filter between the thought and the word. But it's as close as you can get, really, to actual thinking. One thing that's interesting is to find out who is being addressed. Again, if I take the example of a person correcting somebody's work, sometimes they address the student. They say, this was not a very good piece of work, was it? Sometimes they talk to themselves. Interesting. Maybe they're just talking generally. And sometimes it's not easy to tell the difference. Some people suggest it's necessary to train participants to think aloud. Well, maybe that depends on whether they feel comfortable doing that. On the whole, it's probably better not to train them, but there are different ways, different techniques you can use. Another issue that arises is the decision as to whether the researcher should be present during the think aloud or absent. If the researcher is present, this may affect the speaking aloud, and in fact it may cause the person to think aloud to talk to the researcher and not talk to themselves. On the other hand, the presence of the researcher may encourage the person to think aloud by silent back channeling like that. Also, of course, if the researcher is present and perhaps sitting close to or behind the thinker aloud, they can observe their actions as well as their speech. So it's an interesting way of getting what people think by asking them to think aloud or think aloud with other people. Another way, of course, and this is a very well-established procedure for collecting observed data, is to actually see what they're doing in the classroom. And by doing this, you can see what actually happens in a classroom, not merely what people say happens. And it's often the case that a person says they believe in something, but they don't actually do it. I mean, a very good example is a teacher might say, I really do encourage communicative language teaching in my classroom, but with the exams coming up, I've got to focus on preparing the students for the exam, and they don't have to do any communication in the exam. So there are often good reasons why they believe one thing and do another. And it's a good idea if you interview people, if you observe them, to see the extent of the match or mismatch. By observing the classrooms, you can focus on key issues. For example, if you're researching the teaching of writing skills, you can see how that's actually done as well as what people say is being done. And if we think about learner autonomy, we can find out a number of different ways by which learners can be taught to be more autonomous. One of the problems, and you're aware of this because most of us have been observed at one time or another, perhaps many times, is that you know that when somebody goes into your classroom, to a greater or lesser extent, they will change what happens when they're not there. So we call this the observer's paradox, that what you see is not what happens when you're not there. And then this raises the issue as to the extent to which you are visible in the classroom. Do you sit at the back of the room, just making notes or with a digital voice recorder, or do you move around the classroom? One can be more intrusive than another. Obviously, if you're moving around the classroom, students notice you there, but if you're sitting at the back of the room doing nothing, they also see you doing nothing, and they may wonder what you're thinking. It's a good idea, if you can, of course, to make yourself familiar with the teacher and the students before you start researching them. To be frank, most people don't like being observed, and they certainly don't like being video recorded, and they don't necessarily like being audio recorded. And it's obviously important to get their consent, both the teachers and, where necessary, the students' consent to your presence. Another issue to consider is how you're going to record the classroom data. Are you going to use a video camera? Are you going to use a digital voice recorder? Are you going to write field notes? Ideally, all three. If you have a digital voice, if you have a video camera, you can just place that in a particular part of the room and just leave it there. If you use a digital voice recorder, you can put it in the teacher's hands, or indeed, depending on the situation, you can put digital voice recorders in front of some of the students, if they let you. And then, of course, you should also make notes while you're observing the lesson. One of the problems with classroom observation is transcribing the data, because it's extremely difficult. You can usually capture what the teacher is saying, but when the students are talking, it's very difficult to identify who is talking, and certainly to hear what they're saying when you've got a class of anything more than 20 people. And it's difficult enough when there are fewer than 20 people. So the idea is not to try to transcribe the whole lesson, but only those that you wish to focus on. So, 3 or 4 ways of collecting data by observing. There was the experiment, and as I said, the quasi-experiment, where you just do something like an experiment. There is thinking aloud, getting people to think aloud by themselves or with other people's when they're making decisions. And there's observing classrooms. Now, the third category of data collection I mentioned was reflection. And there are again 3 or 4 ways of doing that. The first is what is usually called stimulated recall, which is actually a post-lesson discussion. I feel it very important, if I've observed a lesson, to talk to the teacher after the lesson. And indeed, rather, I should say, to listen to the teacher after the lesson. Because what I've observed in a classroom is my perception. And I can observe behaviour, but I cannot observe meaning. I cannot observe intention. So while I can see what somebody is doing, I have no idea why they're doing it. I may make an idea, but it may not be what the teacher or the learners think. So, following a lesson, we should have a stimulated recall session, where the participants, and certainly the teacher, maybe even the students, can explain the intentions behind their classroom behaviour. They may also rationalise later why they did it. Now, 2 separate things. What they were thinking at the time and what they think now afterwards. Now, that's a different perception, isn't it? And we call this stimulated recall because we use some means of stimulating their memory. We might use extracts from a video recording. We might use extracts from an audio recording. We might use part of our field notes to stimulate. So, for example, look at this piece of what was going on in the classroom. Can you tell me, when you were doing that, what were you thinking? Or perhaps get them to do the same with an audio recording, or, as I say, your field notes. So you need to stimulate their memory, because it's all too easy to forget. And this raises the issue, is how soon after the event, after the lesson, will you have this interview? You do need a break. I mean, you can't do it 5 minutes. Nobody's had time to think. But people say that if you delay 24 hours, people will forget, particularly teachers who teach the lesson you've observed. They may teach 2 or 3 other lessons, and you see them the following day, and they've completely forgotten what they did. I know that I do. So really, you should try and see them pretty soon after the event. Maybe if they've taught in the morning, maybe just after lunch, by which time you will have had time to collect your thoughts, to select which particular areas or incidents you want to focus on, and perhaps identified on the video or audio recording or on your field notes the key points that you want to discuss, the key points you want the teacher to discuss, because we want the teacher to talk, not you. So, as I say, the important thing is, when do you do it? How do you stimulate the recall? How can you distinguish between what they were thinking at the time and what they think now? And this requires you to think carefully about how you frame the question. You provide the stimulus and you say, at the time, what did you think? Yeah? So you get the stimulus, and you put their minds in the time frame by saying, at the time, why did you do that? Or if you want to get them to rationalise their behaviour now, you could say, well, at the time, what were you thinking? Would you do the same thing again? Okay, so you distinguish between what they thought at the time and what they were thinking now. So the post-lesson discussion by stimulated recall. Another approach, which I've used quite often, is to use a focus group. Now, this is like a group interview, and some researchers begin a research project with a focus group because this stimulates ideas for their research. But I think it's a very good thing to have a focus group towards the end of your research project. If they've done a questionnaire, or if they've done an interview, or if they've been observed and had a post-lesson, it's all been traffic between you and the participant individually. And I think it's a good idea, if you are observing a number of teachers in a school, for example, or you've been interviewing a number of teachers in a school, towards the end, to get them together as a group and let them discuss the ideas that you've found. You've found that there's this is going on, this is a good idea, this was one thing that could have been improved, and you get them to discuss it. And in this way, they share their experiences and they co-construct possible solutions to any problems. And also, having discussed and possibly found some solutions, there are some other issues that have been uncovered in the course of this discussion. So the questions arise as to when you should do this, as I say, at the beginning or towards the end of your research, but how soon? And how soon after you've done your observations or interviews? How long should it last? Again, if you ask people to spend 30 minutes and they quite happily talk about the issues that you want them to talk about for 45 minutes or an hour, that shows that they find it beneficial, and you will too. How do you compose the focus group? How many people? Well, I think that 3 is a good number, 4 is a good number, 5. Somebody isn't talking in a group of 5. So an ideal number is 3 or 4. And you have to think about the power relationships in a group. Some people are naturally more dominant than others. Some are more reticent. Some of them may be more senior than others. And therefore, they may feel that they have more talking rights than others, and others may feel that they have more talking rights. So you have to think about the composition of the group and the power relations that might exist. But by the time you hold a focus group in a school towards the end of your research, you've got to know your participants pretty well, so you can think about how best to do it. Once again, do you think that the researcher should be present or absent? Matter of judgment. If you feel that the participants can talk quite happily without your being there, just put a digital voice recorder down and leave the room. If, on the other hand, you think they might need some stimulus to move from topic to topic, then you might want to be present. But it's a matter of judgment. And then, once again, the issue of how to record the session and how to transcribe it. And the final approach of reflection is to think about a reflective journal. This is another way to get the participants, be they teachers or students, to think about what they've been doing on the events, experiences, what they've learned, how they felt during the course of a lesson or during the course of a period of weeks. It can extend from a simple diary of a lesson or two or a week or two, and it can extend perhaps over a term when the participants keep a weekly journal. Some issues arise. The difference between a log, a journal, and a diary. A log is simply a factual record of what was done at a certain time and a certain place, with very few comments. A journal can be considered to be more of a commentary, so it has the same information as a log, but more commentary. And I would think a diary would be a more emotional thing, expressing one's emotions. If you have ever kept a diary to yourself, you put there private ideas that you don't want to share with other people. One issue you might want to think about is whether this journal or diary should be written or spoken. Some cultures, I was doing some research in East Timor, and I felt that it was more appropriate for the people there to give an oral diary, because they certainly weren't used to writing in English, but they weren't used to writing in Teton, the national language. So I felt it better that they kept an oral diary. And I also thought some of them could do it in pairs and some of them could do it by themselves. So that's another option to consider. But perhaps the most important thing to consider about reflective journals and diaries is who is the intended reader. If people know that you are going to read their journal or diary, that will affect what they say. Particularly if you're a teacher and you ask your students to keep a learning diary or a learning journal, they will not tell you what they really feel. So I think you need to address this carefully and say to the people, either you will or you will not read their diary or journal. If you decide that you will read the diary or journal, then you need to take into account the fact that they may not reveal what they really feel. If, on the other hand, you do not read the journal, you have to ask them to report extracts from their diary or journal, and they can choose what they want to show you, and they can choose, perhaps, to edit it. Now, once again, these are matters of choice. On the whole, I would prefer not to see the journals directly, but ask my participants to report on it, to give me extracts from it. So just to finish, a couple of points. That all these different ways of collecting data need practice and piloting. The researcher needs to practice the relevant technical and interpersonal skills needed for the intended data collection procedure. This can be done with critical friends. Interview a friend of yours about their teaching practice. Interview them about what they believe about learner autonomy. Practice with a friend. Preferably record this practice, either with a video camera or with a voice recorder, because it's important to learn yourself how you ask questions, and to learn too your body language when asking questions. Do you look too intently at people? Do you look down all the time? Are you listening attentively? These are sort of things that you need to practice. Obviously, the same is true with questionnaires. All the other procedures you need to practice before you can be confident to use them with research participants. And when you're sufficiently confident and competent to do your data collection tools, it's necessary to pilot them. Now, we talked about practicing with critical friends, but you need to pilot the ways of collecting data with people who are like your participants, but obviously not your participants. So if, for example, you're going to interview teachers in your school, then you should interview teachers who are not in your school to give you practice and to pilot what they say. Because by asking other teachers in another school, you will get an idea of what your teachers are going to say. And by piloting with other teachers, you're going to refine your interviewing and other technical procedures. I've mentioned the need for reflective diaries, and I think, as Simon Borg has recommended, that the researcher should also keep a journal or a diary to remind the researcher of past ideas, events and feelings, to guide subsequent actions, to provide a record of plans and achievements or the extent of achievement, to recount events and procedures which allow a detailed write-up of the findings. A research journal will comprise an instructive narrative of the researcher's professional growth. Whether you're doing an action research over several weeks, an MA research for a year, or a PhD for 4 years, all of these are professional growths. So it's important to keep a narrative of these. And keeping your journal and reflecting on that journal will help to spark off further insights for yourself or to share with other colleagues. So, in conclusion, it's important to choose the appropriate methods to collect data to answer your questions in the specific context of your study. One method is usually not enough. 2, or at the most 3, ways of collecting data are sufficient for an MA thesis or an action research project. 3 or 4 are appropriate for a PhD project. So you have a number of different ways of collecting data to think about and to choose. So I hope this has been useful for you in thinking about carrying out research. Thank you.